All right, so here we have some shiny guts. This is the human digestive system. It doesn't contain any of the pharyngeal structures of the digestive system, which means all of the stuff that's up here. So we'll do that in a different video and different session with a different model, but this has a lot of good stuff in it. So I'm going to go ahead and spin this around and we're going to kind of work our way from top to bottom. So this is what it looks like from the back. Oops, I want it to be down some more. There we go. So here we have the esophagus. And this is going to be a muscular tube that basically connects your oropharynx, which is the muscular funnel that you use to swallow with, to your stomach. Quick spelling note on esophagus. Excuse me. The British spelling has an O here, but in America we just do E. So either is acceptable, of course, but I would just casually suggest that you use just the E because it's just easier and not as confusing looking to spell that way. So the only reason I'm giving you a heads up is because, of course, you're going to interact with stuff on the internet to try and learn this stuff, and that can end up being confusing over time. So just FYI, if you see that spelling, that's a legit spelling. We just don't do it that way in the States. Okay. So let's see if my pen has decided to work again. Doesn't look like it. One sec. I'm gonna pause the recording and grab a battery for my stylus thing here. Recording. Okay, so that's the esophagus. The area where the esophagus meets the stomach, the area of the stomach right by the entrance of the esophagus is called the cardia. And for that reason, the sphincter that regulates the passage of food from the esophagus into the stomach is often called the cardiac sphincter, which is confusing to students because they're like, but that seems like it would be about the heart. And you're right, it does. But the reason for that is because sensation-wise, this is where you feel pain if you have heartburn. And it's, of course, not really your heart, but it feels like it is because it's in your chest. So if you've ever had heartburn, oh, it's so awful, but that's your pain you're feeling due to acid reflux in the cardia area of your stomach. The cardiac sphincter is also called the gastroesophageal sphincter, which just means stomach esophagus sphincter, and that makes a lot of sense as well. It's also sometimes called the lower esophageal sphincter. So kind of like the mitral valve of the heart, this is a thing that has lots of different names. So moving on to regions of the stomach, and I actually have a separate video for regions of the stomach in the short videos topic by topic playlist. So if you want to go check that out, you're welcome to also. This dome-shaped bumpy area of the stomach is called the fundus. And that's similar to the fundus of the uterus. So any hollow organ that has a dome-shaped top area, it's called the fundus. And then the rest of the stomach, this sort of vertical region, is the body. And then what you'll notice is that right about here, it makes a turn. And the area after the turn, which I'm going to sort of tilt the model for, is called the pylorus. Love you, bye. Okay, so that's the pylorus. So I'm going to flip this around now, and we're going to look at the pylorus from a different angle. The front, there we go. I wish I could subtract the liver, but I don't believe that I can. That would be handy. But in the video, on the short videos playlist, you can see it. So basically the stomach makes this sort of C shape. And it narrows as it approaches the duodenum. So I'm drawing over here. So this is the pylorus, which is that region. So that's going to be this region right here. So the reason for the pylorus having its own name is a couple different things. One of them is that it's an area that has a lot of enteroendocrine cells, and those cells secrete chemicals that allow the pylorus of the stomach to talk to the duodenum. So that's why it gets a separate name. So once again, from the back, oh, there's a nice view of it. Yes, so you can see it here. And then this little C-shaped region of the small intestine that's right after the stomach, and it's relatively short. It hugs the pancreas. Is called the duodenum. And that is the first of the 3 regions of the small intestine. Now, this stuff is elements of the biliary tree. We'll go over that in a minute, so you can ignore it for now. We're going to do the regions of the intestines first. So the first of the 3 is, of course, the duodenum, and this is a very, very short C-shaped region of the small intestine, and it hugs the head of the pancreas, which I'm going to turn this around so you can kind of see that a little bit. I might bring up my other anatomy tool in a second here to see if I can show this separately. But you can see the pancreas is right there. And then the duodenum is hugging the head of it like so. So it's very short. It's not very long at all. It's just the C-shaped region that hugs the pancreas. The rest of the small intestines are divided roughly like so. So the jejunum and the ileum are the second and third regions along the way. And we can see, if I turn this around, the ileum plugs into the cecum right there. So visually, as far as like being able to tell which is which, you're not going to be able to tell exactly where one ends and the other begins, and that's okay. So I'm going to draw like a little dotted line, and that's going to show you more or less the cutoff, such that if I use like a, image and I cut it in half and I mark one spot or the other, you'll be able to tell that it's not in the middle and not in like a weird no man's land where it's hard to tell what I'm pointing at or indicating. So hold on, I dropped my pen. There it is. So the cutoff is more or less just straight through the mass of intestines, like so. So note that ileum is spelled I-L-E-U-M, not I-L-I-U-M. The reason I'm making that spelling note is because I-L-I-U-M was part of the os coxa from last term, and it's a completely different structure. So if you spell it I-L-I-U-M, that will result in me not being able to give you any credit because I can't tell if you know that it's in the intestine, and you're stating a completely different word. It's not actually a spelling error. It's just a transposition of terms. So just heads up, make sure you use this E right here. It's important. All right. So that's the jejunum and the ileum. Why do they get separate names? Well, as you'll learn for the next practical, the histology of these regions is different because by the time food makes it down to the ileum, it's nearly feces, and the epithelium that lines the tract changes according to how processed the food/feces is as it makes its way through the tube. So that's the idea there. Okay, so let's flip this around again and go look at that spot where the ileum plugs into the cecum again. So it's kind of weird because what you would expect would just be like it just like smoothly transitions into the tube like so, right? But it doesn't do that. The ileum plugs into the side here, and the sphincter that regulates the passage of feces into the cecum from the ileum is called the ileocecal. One second, I'm going to cough. Hold on. I'm going to mute my mic while I do that. Okay, sorry about that. The ileocecal valve. So ileo just means ileum and cecal means cecum. So what's the cecum? Well, the cecum is this bag-shaped bit of the large intestine or colon that hangs below the ileocecal valve. So feces actually drops down into here first before it goes up. And it's a blind-ended pouch with like a little thingy hanging off of it. And that thingy is, of course, your appendix. So let's flip this around and let's go look at the appendix. How best to see it? Okay. There, I'm just going to move this a little bit. So this little wormy guy down here is the appendix. It's just literally hanging off the bottom of the cecum. So it's called the appendix / you'll also see it called the vermiform appendix. Vermiform just means worm-like. So verm is the Latin root for worm. So vermiform just means it's worm-shaped. And if you look at it, it really is. It's just like a little worm-shaped blind-ended pouch that hangs off the cecum, which is here again. So can I get a show of hands in the chat? Who still has their appendix? I do not have an appendix any longer. Anybody else still have theirs or is appendix free? I see one do not. I had an emergency appendectomy when I was a teenager because my appendix blew up and it nearly killed me. So here's the deal with the appendix. And for those of you who still have one, I'm going to describe the symptoms of appendicitis so that if you ever get it, you will know and not almost suffer the same fate that I did. So here's the deal with the appendix. It is a vestigial structure, meaning that evolutionarily it used to have some other function, but now it's not useful to us really, and it kind of just sits there. There is some theories about it being an immune surveillance station because it's rich with lymphatic tissue. So you'll actually be able to see that in the histology of it for the next lab practical, be able to look at it. And you'll see large lymphatic nodules in it. So there's some theories that state that it might be an immune surveillance station to kind of watch the bacteria in your colon right here. So this is the ascending colon. But in the appendix, since it is a blind-ended pouch, poop gets stuck in there. And it forms these fecal concretions, which is a fancy way of saying poop crystal. So in anatomy and physiology, when we have an organ that develops rigid, hard, crystalline sort of impactions or growths, we call them concretions. And what that word means is it describes a situation in which something has crystallized into a solid. So that's what the fecal concretions are. But because there's a lot of bacteria in the colon, sometimes they can go hide in the appendix and have like a little party. And that results in the appendix becoming very large and angry and distended. And that causes a bunch of different things. But I'm going to zoom out here and show you the primary clinical manifestation. So you might remember the body regions from early last term, just basic sort of regional anatomy. So we had this situation where we had quadrants. So this is the right lower quadrant. So abdominal bloating is a big symptom of appendicitis. So when I had it long ago, I was unable to suck my stomach in, like, you know, in the classical way that you can with your abdominal muscles. I couldn't do that. I had a very bloated, distended abdomen. And with appendicitis, what happens is if the clinician pushes on the right lower quadrant, it doesn't hurt until they take their hand away and the inflammation is allowed to return to the appendix, and then it hurts a lot. So pushing in and then pain with release of the pushing is really, really classical for appendicitis, specifically as it relates to the right lower quadrant. So that would be a symptom to watch out for. And of course, appetite changes, difficulty with defecation, bloating, all of those things are appendicitis symptoms. So just be watchful and be mindful, because if your appendix bursts, all of that bacteria ends up in your peritoneal cavity, which can give you very, very bad peritonitis and put your life at risk. So we don't want that. Okay. So this is the idealized colon. So colon and large intestine, by the way, are synonymous. So that's something that's sometimes a little bit tricky for students, and I just want to be absolutely clear about it. So colon equals large intestine, and it's not referring to the largeness of the length of the tube, it's the diameter of the tube. So I'm going to outline the entire colon right now. So that is the colon, or large intestine. So it has three main regions in addition to the cecum. So above the cecum, poop is going up. So we call it the ascending colon. At the top here, poop is transversing in the transverse plane. So this we call the transverse colon. And then we have poop going downwards here. So we have the descending colon. And then this S-shaped region at the very bottom is called the sigmoid or sigmoidal colon. Sigmoid meaning S-shaped curve. So those are the overarching regions of the large intestine or the colon. And as you can see, they're mostly named for either shapes or the direction in which poop is traveling through them. Okay. So let's look at some details of the colon. So what you're going to notice is that there's you guys can see this stripe here. It's running all the way up and across and down on the surface of the colon. There's actually 3 of these. You're just seeing one of them here. So there's 3 positioned around the tube. And collectively, they're named the Taenia coli. So Taenia is plural. Taenia is singular. So all of your intestines have an outer and an inner muscular layer to achieve peristalsis. So peristalsis is the movement of food or feces forward through a tube. In the small intestine, there is, I'm going to draw a little model or diagram of it over here. In the small intestine, there's an inner circular layer, and then there's an outer longitudinal layer. So you'd get 2 views of smooth muscle like so. In the large intestine, you still have that inner layer, but now the outer longitudinal layer is just, instead of going all the way around, it's just 3 long strips. So those are the Taenia coli from a different view. Hopefully that makes sense. So basically the outer longitudinal layer is reduced to not covering the entire surface, but now only 3 strips. But it still contracts, so it contracts in this direction. And then you can also see these bulges here. See those little lumpy guys? These are called haustra. And singular is, let me move the chat really quick so I can draw. Oh no, too big. Singular is 1. Haustrum, singular. So these are just sort of baggy areas that bulge out as a result of the contraction of the Taenia coli. They're also a place where diverticuli tend to form. If you've heard of diverticulitis, a diverticulum is basically an outgrowth or pouching of a haustrum like so. And they tend to, like the intestines, fill up with feces and become inflamed and painful. And that creates all kinds of problems. And they can rupture, which is a medical emergency. So just quick clinical note on haustra. Okay, so let's look at some of this stuff from the back. So you can see the Taenia coli ends right here. And then after that, we've got this smooth structure of smooth muscle. So this smooth structure is the rectum. So you might remember from discussing the muscles that rectus means straight up and down. So remember we had the rectus abdominis because it went straight up and down. Rectum is named because it basically is straight up and down. So that's why it's named the thing it is, and it reflects its appearance. So this is the last place that feces goes before it's expelled out of the body via the anal canal. So let's turn this a little bit. So although it's curving backwards, and this reflects the shape of the pelvis, right? So we can see if this was the body, and this is the anus right here, the outlet, Your tailbone, your sacrum, and your coccyx would be there. So that's reflecting that curve that you can see on the rectum. Okay, so let's go look at the liver, and then I'm going to probably switch models to show you the details of the biliary tree and some of the other stuff because it's a little bit hidden here. So this is your liver. Come on. There we go. So your liver is a large, squishy organ. It's suspended from the diaphragm, which would be here, by a ligament called the falciform ligament, which would go up like so. So it attaches to the coronal ligament, which is the top one. And then the falciform kind of does this. So imagine that you are carrying a large bag of dog food, and you're carrying it under your arm. So your arm is going to be supporting the sort of amorphous blob that is the dog food, and then the bag is going to kind of hang down to either side of your arm. That's analogous to how the falciform ligament holds up the liver. It kind of hoists it, and then the two lobes, the right lobe and the left lobe, hang down on either side like so. So you can see that there. The right lobe is the largest. So anybody who presents in the emergency department, especially if they've been in a car accident or a fight with right upper quadrant pain, you want to be mindful of looking for a liver laceration. If you get hit hard enough in the liver, the surface of it can split, and that creates internal bleeding, and it's very dangerous. So right upper quadrant pain is something to be investigated, let's say. Okay, so flipping around to the back. So there's a question in the chat, which is, can we see the round ligament here? That's a great question. No, you cannot, but I'm going to turn this and I will draw it in. So let's tilt that a little bit. There we go. So the round ligament is actually a leftover from fetal circulation, and it's attached to the belly button. So if the round ligament were here, what you would see would be something that looks like this, where it's round and it reaches forwards towards your umbilicus, your belly button. So at birth, when the umbilical cord collapses because of the pressure changes and other stuff, the internal umbilical cord, not the external, which is cut. But that collapses due to pressure changes and the neonate being able to, breathe and have their heartbeat on their own. It collapses and basically fuses into the round ligament of the liver. And I'm going to pause for just a second here because my computer is telling me it's low on battery and I want to plug it in so I can keep presenting to you. All right, so the model I was using did not have a pharynx or any of the upper portions. So I went and picked an image from the textbook. And this is also, of course, reflective of the images that you'll see on your test, because I'm just going to use the images with no labels. See, so just like that. This is a good example of an image you could see on the practical, which I think we can all agree when you have an image that you've seen before on a test, it's nice, it helps. Familiarity is good, so win-win all the way around. So what I'm going to show you is the elements of the pharynx and the regions of them as well. And I'm going to do that I'm going to highlight them because it's confusing for students. They have a hard time with the regions of the pharynx and other aspects of this because it's just a series of connected spaces. And so one of the things students struggle with is understanding where one ends and the other begins. So the first major space we're going to highlight is the nasal cavity. Which is just the space inside of your external nostril. So let's add some other aspects of this. So we have external nares, nares is plural. Naris is sometimes spelled Narice, and it's sometimes spelled Naris. And then nares is plural. So if you're going to refer, if you were going to refer to both of them, oops, in the plural, you would say nares, like so. And then you have an internal nares as well, which is at the back. But these are the two holes that connect the outside world with the inside of your face via your nose. So after the nasal cavity, which I will also label, probably in a different color, nasal cavity, that's really hard to read. You get the idea. I'll just do it in black. So that's the nasal cavity highlighted in green. So it's a space. So if you were to see a question like this and it said identify the space, I'm trying to get you to say nasal cavity. Now in the nasal cavity, there are these three ridges that are covered in flesh. And these are the nasal conchae. That's how you say that word, conchae, Conchae. No, I don't want this thing. Sorry about that, the little side panel pulled up. So nasal conchae is plural. So we have the superior, middle, and inferior nasal concha, which is the singular form. Now I have to switch to white because I'm off the screen. So concha is singular. Conchae is plural. So next, we're going to go ahead and highlight this area here. And I'm going to go ahead and highlight the rest of them in advance just so that I have it all done. Let's see. We'll do yellow. And red. So the blue is the nasopharynx. The red, or excuse me, the yellow is the oropharynx. So let's write these here because they have pointers. That's hard to read. Hold on, let me write that again. And the red is the laryngopharynx, referring to its proximity to the larynx, which is the area of this muscular funnel that is closest to your voice box. So laryngopharynx is next to the larynx, which is the larynx is the thing I've circled here. So oropharynx goes from the tip of the soft palate, which is the uvula. So this little guy is the uvula. And as you can see, there's from the tip of the uvula down to the tip of the epiglottis, which is what this guy is. That's the oropharynx. The nasopharynx is above that. I'm going to erase my highlighting here so I can point at some features of the nasopharynx. So what you'll notice is that there is a tonsil in the nasopharynx, your pharyngeal tonsil. And then there's also this hole here. And that hole is the opening of the eustachian tube. So remember from lab at the end of last term when we were doing the ear and the eye, you had to learn about the eustachian tube, which was also sometimes called the pharyngotympanic tube. Pharyngotympanic means connecting the pharynx to the tympanic chamber or cavity. And that is exactly what it does. So here's the opening of it in the nasopharynx. So one thing that students often worry about or get confused about is how are you going to ask and how will I know if you mean the opening for the eustachian tube or if you mean the pharynx? And the answer is if I'm pointing only to this, I'm going to point only to that. If I want you to say nasopharynx, I'm going to highlight the entire nasopharynx and say identify the space. If I want the opening of the eustachian tube, I'll say identify the specific opening. So you'll have both a highlighting clue and a pointer clue and a verbal clue about what I want you to say. So just that should help clear that up. Okay, so moving on down from there, we've got the larynx and the epiglottis, which I'll relabel. And then anteriorly, on the front of the larynx, we've got the thyroid cartilage. And then down there underneath, we have the cricoid cartilage. And I'll show you the front view of these as well. So these are the two cartilages that help to form the front part of your voice box. And then this little weird slit thing is your vocal cords, but this isn't it's not a good view of them, so I wouldn't ask you that question on this particular image. So let's go to another image. Okay, this is a good one. All right, so here we have a larynx, the front part. So this bone is the hyoid bone, which you might remember from last term. And then peeking up over the top